Welcome back to the Anglotopia podcast, the podcast for people who love British travel, history, and culture. I'm your host, Jonathan Thomas, and today we're diving into the fascinating world of language with someone who has spent over 2 decades examining the subtle and not so subtle differences between how Americans and British people speak English. Our guest is Professor Lynne Murphy, a linguistics professor at the University of Sussex and author of The Prodigal Tongue, the love-hate relationship between American and British English. It's a lovely book. Lynne is also the brilliant mind behind the blog Separated by a Common Language, where she's been documenting British-American English differences since 2006, which actually makes your blog older than my blog. So well done. But what makes Lynne especially intriguing for our show is her unique perspective. She's an American expat who's been living in England since 2000, so she's experienced linguistic culture clash firsthand while also studying it professionally. So today, we're exploring her journey from Western New York to Brighton, the myths and misconceptions that drive her crazy on both sides of the Atlantic, and some delightful examples of how our two countries are separated by a common language that can still surprise each other. Whether you've been confused by a British rubber versus an American eraser, or wonder why Americans drop the U from color, you're in for a treat. Welcome, Lynne.
Hello, nice to be here.
Thank you for coming on the podcast. I'm so excited about having you on. Big fan of your work. So let's start at the beginning. What's your story? How did you end up in Brighton at the University of Sussex? And was it purely academic, or were you looking for a change of scenery?
Well, I was looking for a change of scenery. I was in Texas at a university that I maybe wasn't the best fit for. So I was looking for a job. And if you are a lexicologist, which is what I am, in which, there are probably 20 people in the world who call themselves lexicologists, the jobs, you have to go where they are, rather than waiting for them to come to you. So yes, they advertised a position at the University of Sussex, and I was excited to come. I had never been to England before. I came sight unseen, but I'm really glad I did.
So were you an Anglophile before you went, or was it just Anglophile by accident?
I don't call myself an Anglophile. I know the English too well. Yeah, I enjoy the language. I enjoy language in general. I enjoy having a job in linguistics, so that's what brought me to England, and I love living here. I'm very happy I made that change.
Very jealous. So, how did your early academic experiences in South Africa and Texas shape your perspective on language when you arrived in England?
Well, I'd already had the experience of having to learn that other people say things differently, having to adjust my expectations about what things meant or how they'd sound. And I had a bit of an early familiarity, not just with things like how to spell color, which in South Africa you'd follow the British standard, but also things like how a university works, and the jargon around my job. I already knew all that by living in South Africa, where everything in the Anglophone parts of South Africa is very influenced by the UK.
Interesting. So when you arrived, you were kind of used to it already.
Yeah, I remember there were American exchange students my first term, and they were like, "How do you know this already? We haven't figured anything out." But it was like, yeah, I know what a 3-year bachelor's degree is shaped like, and things like that, which are quite a big change if you're coming straight from the US.
Forgive me, this question isn't on my list I gave you, but
Okay.
that experience in South Africa. Now, did you find that South African English was very, very influenced by Afrikaans at all? Was there kind of a...
There are words and there are pronunciations. So, and it depends, there are a lot of different accents in South
Right.
Africa, depending on your ethnic background. So, one thing that's a lot of fun about South African English is it has got some words that neither British or American English have. Sometimes that's borrowings from Afrikaans or borrowings from African languages or borrowings from Indian languages. But, some things like everybody's favorite would be robot. So a traffic light is a robot in South African English, and that's just a great word.
Yeah, I mean, it is a robot, right? Technically,
Yeah.
it makes sense.
I think especially, in the early days, maybe when they were raising a flag instead of
Yeah,
a colored light, it was a robot.
I love that. So, was there any particular moment or experience early in your time in England that made you think I need to start documenting these language differences?
Well, I think I started documenting them when I was 6 years in when I started the blog. So by that point, I'd realized that not only were there a lot of things I was learning because I hadn't learned them in South Africa during my 4 years there, but on top of that, I was going to keep learning new things about this language forever. That if I tried to look up some of the differences I was coming up against, they weren't in dictionaries. So once I realized that there wasn't going to be an end to the differences, that's when I sort of thought, okay, well, I might as well start a lifelong project to write them down. Yeah. So the key point, I think, the first blog post I did was about roil, Roil, because a colleague of mine had talked about a rolling boil, and I had talked about a roiling boil, because in my English, boils roil. They, and so, it was that point where I realized, yeah, it was never going to end. There were always going to be little subtle differences. It wasn't just the big ones that everybody knew. That's where it started.
Right. So then you started your blog, which is separated by a common language, and we will of course link in the show notes. So what was the catalyst that made you think I'm going to start a blog? Because this was in 2006, back when blogs were a new thing.
When they were an exciting thing. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, one thing was just procrastination. I had a textbook due. I was supposed to be working on it, and I didn't want to. So that's always why I start blogs, is because there's something else I should be working on.
I
Um,
know that only too well.
yeah. Um, but it was a good time in terms of where blogs were. There were a lot of people trying to start blogs about language, but I think it was a really good time to start a blog about a specific topic like this that could carry on forever, because what was out there were various websites and dictionaries where people were just collecting things but not saying anything about them. So there was the opportunity to go a little bit deeper.
Guilty is charged. So. I'm an inveterate collector, and that's on our website, and that's we like to be a starting point for more
Yeah,
research.
yeah. And the thing is, anybody who works on dictionaries will tell you they don't end. There's
Yeah,
always more to add. So yeah, so it was an opportunity to create something that could roll on, and get more creative for a long time. So
and like us, you're still at it. So way to go! Keep it
still
to
at
it.
it. I mean, when I was on Twitter, I mean, I'm technically still there, but I'm not posting. But, for 9 years, I did a difference of the day every day, and I hardly ever repeated. So there are
Wow.
that many differences to talk about, and I never got to the end. This week, I blogged about American in the fine print versus British in the small print. I had never noticed that before somebody pointed out to me this week. I've been here 25 years, so there's always more. There's always more to say.
Yeah, there is, and for the people who are going to peruse the show notes, where are you most active now on social media? Since you're not on Twitter as active anymore.
I'm on Blue Sky, not as active as I ever was on Twitter. I've got a Facebook page where I tend to re-link to other people's stuff. But I've got a Substack where I have a monthly newsletter.
Okay.
And everything's under Linguist, Lynneguist. So I can be found that way. So once a month I blog, and once a month I do the newsletter, which is the blog what I've been up to, and lots of language links.
All right. Well, and the links for all of those will be in the show notes. So, in your book, well, actually, I want to know a little more about the history of the book. How did the book come about? And how has it? What has been the response since? Because it came out, was it 2018, I believe?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, the book, because I'd written a blog for so long, I'd had various people ask me if I wanted to do a book, and I tried a few times to get it started. Didn't quite hit on what I wanted. I finally did, and was very lucky to get a grant from the National Endowment of the Humanities. Yeah, to take a year out and work on it. So that's, yeah, I did that in 2016, came out in 2018. And it really, I mean, what was stunning about the book was just how much it gave me the opportunity to learn so much more about the background to these things. Because writing the blog was my hobby. My job in linguistics wasn't about British and American English at that point. So, this gave me the reason to read a lot of history that I had to learn in seventh grade, but resented it then and found it so interesting now, and read a lot about the social forces behind language and stuff that wasn't necessarily what I do most of the time.
Fascinating. So, in your book, you write about the American verbal inferiority complex and the British verbal superiority complex. Can you explain what these are and how they kind of manifest in everyday interactions?
Yeah, I mean, I would say you can find superiority on both sides. You can find inferiority on both sides. But what I was talking about in particular is things like the stereotype that if you speak with a British accent or a sort of standard British accent, that you must be more intelligent. Those sorts of biases that, Americans will have where they feel inferior if somebody else is speaking British English, or they assume that the British speaker always knows what's correct grammatically, or they assume that if British people say one thing and I say another thing, the British people must have it right. Now, not all Americans are like that, and not all Americans are like that all the time, but it's a pattern you can see a lot. And then on the other side, the British superiority complex would be the assumption that if it's American, it's wrong, and one can see that a lot.
Yeah, I believe me, as a longtime runner of a blog, I am told I'm wrong all the time.
Yes.
Yeah. So I've often talking to British expats here in the USA. They often say that their accent is a superpower in their careers here. That there's this inbuilt positive bias towards them because they speak with a British accent. It doesn't matter which British accent; Americans can't tell the difference. Um, do you find, is there a corollary to that working in the UK, that your American accent gives you a different sort of career trajectory or different perception?
I don't know that I don't think it's made my career go up or down in any particular way, but it, there is, I mean, it's always remarked upon, that's for sure. Um, and yeah, the first term, or maybe the second term I was teaching here, I had a student who was a retired Royal Air Force man who decided to go back to university and study the language because he loved it. And it was a problem for him that it was an American teaching him about it. I mean, we had a great time together, but you always sort of felt like, well, what does she know? And what did I know at the time? I was new here, but yeah, sometimes there can be a little bit of frisson, but yeah, in the main, it's all right. And of course, one of the things that the British congratulate themselves on often is the ability to laugh at themselves. So if we can laugh together about our differences, that's all right.
That's very true. Uh, and it's also it's that joshing and ribbing between friends. Like, oh, it's funny. Sometimes it can get a little scary. But sometimes, most of the time, it's fun.
Most of the time.
So, what's the most persistent myth about American English that you encounter from British people that makes you just want to scream?
Well, I think the most general thing that we could say is a myth on both sides is that British English is older, and that anything Americans do is, a divergence from British English. And the thing I always have to say is British English didn't exist till American English existed. That term came up much later than the term American English because, it wasn't until the British had an opposite side, that they became one thing and not a whole bunch of people speaking a whole bunch of different Englishes in essence. So the idea that American is a degradation of British English is the big one. But to give an example that comes up a lot, the idea that Americans took the H off of the word HERB. So where Americans say herb and the British say herb, it's actually older not to say the H. And so, like we don't say the H in hour on the clock or in honor or lots of other things. There are all sorts of words that came into English without a pronounced H. But the British added it back in the 19th century, and now assume that Americans removed it and that it's somehow ignorant not to pronounce that H.
Interesting. So on the flip side, what misconceptions do Americans have about British English?
Well, I think the flip side is, that anything in Britain must be old,
Right.
and not new. So, to look at, the OUR spellings, that, Americans must have been the first people to take out the U. Well, that wasn't true. Or, that British people have always spelt things with ISE instead of IZ or ZE. That's not true. So, all those sorts of things where there's just this automatic assumption. I'd say another thing that often I think surprises Americans about British English is that Americans care a lot about grammar. And they're surprised when they hear me say this, but Americans care more about grammar than about things like accent, whereas the British are very attuned to accents. And a lot of the things that we learn as rules in America, especially if you're educated in the humanities like I was, are not actually rules in British English. So, I was once taught that there's a difference between that and which, and I had to remember which one to use when. I was taught not to say try and, but to say try to. And I'd come to England with all these rules that I'd learned as somebody who gets involved in editing and correcting students' work and things like that. And discovered actually all those assumptions I had about correct and incorrect didn't apply here. So, I have seen Americans say things to British people about, well, you know that because it's your language. But those kinds of grammar pickiness things are not the same here and there. There isn't one right English. There are a couple of standards.
Well, according to the British, there's only one right English.
Yeah.
So, you've mentioned that claims like Americans have ruined the English language are often repeated but rarely examined. What's your response when someone says this to you at a dinner party?
Well, most people are too polite to say that to an American at a dinner party.
Good.
Yeah, I mostly see that, in the newspapers, in the media, on TikTok, wherever. But, if people want to talk to me about it, I'll ask for examples. And I very often can say, well, actually, I'm that person. I'm that well, actually person. Well, actually, the H was not pronounced until the 1900s, or actually, the ISE spelling wasn't the standard in Britain until recent decades, and just things like that. And I like to say that British and American, we can't think about them as being one is the child of the other. like many people try to. We have to think of them as sort of cousins. They have some common grandparents way back when, but they've been making their own changes since then. So, I will say, well, British English changes awfully fast.
Yeah.
And, that's part of the reason why they're different. It's not because Americans are changing things, but because British English is changing too.
Yeah, and it's constantly changing. Even since I started the blog game, I've seen new slang words come into use, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting use of that word. Okay, all right, we're gonna do that now. Okay.
Yep. And the accents are constantly morphing. Right.
Yeah,
So
they really are. And I kind of have an ear for the different accents, but even I get caught out. I'm like, I'm sorry, I thought I could place where you were from, and now I cannot figure it out. So, what's your favorite example of a word that means something completely different in American versus British English? And has it ever caused you personal embarrassment to get a word wrong?
I'm sure it has at some point. The biggest embarrassment story I can think of is that historically in British English, I would not say that you should say this today, but slutty just meant sloppy and untidy. And so one time we were in the States, and my husband said to my goddaughter, "Get away from me, you slutty child."
Oh
So
my
that
god!
was embarrassing.
Oh no!
That was embarrassing. But for me, it's more things like I've never got used to the British use of homely, where homely means homey,
Right?
cozy and comfy. And so when people call things of mine homely, I
You're like,
hear the
excuse me.
American ugly meaning. Yeah. So, so that, yeah, that's the one that tends to throw me off track still.
And then you're second guessing yourself. Well, wait a second.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do they really mean it? No.
Maybe they wanted to, both sides that.
You've written about how Americans move from center to center. Can you walk us through one spelling change that really illustrates the historical forces at play here?
I think all the spelling changes do illustrate different things. So with center, with an ER and an RE, um, it started out as an RE in British because it was borrowed from French, and that's what it is in French. It reflects French pronunciation. The British kept it. Um, when it went over to America, it was part of what was sort of the more simplified spelling that Noah Webster brought in his dictionary, which is not to say that he made it up. He chose that spelling. It was probably already there, under the current anyway, because it more reflects how we pronounce the word. But then you can see as you come through to today, you'll find center spelt with an RE in America, right? You'll find it on, such and such medical center, or,
Shopping
some
center.
so and so arts center. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then it becomes a spelling that's classy, So we can bear two spellings in the same place, but when we borrow in a new spelling, sometimes it gets a new meaning. But I'm
Go ahead.
sorry. Go
No, go
ahead.
ahead.
Well, I was going to say I mentioned the ISEIZE or IZE spelling, like in realize, and that's the kind of thing where Noah Webster just took a stance. We're going to use the Z sound because that's what we say. The Oxford English Dictionary also has the Z, the Z first. And for a long time in British publications, you could use either. And it sort of, there were historical reasons, the S came from French, the Z came from elsewhere. But what happened after spell check became a big thing is people stopped being comfortable with there being two spellings. And so those two spellings, really since the 1990s have diverged in Britain, with people seeing the IZE spelling as being the American spelling when it wasn't until very, very recently. So it's still now we're making differences. You know, old differences become deeper differences in some cases.
And it's really hard to work with. I worked for an Irish company for many years, and they obviously spell everything the proper way, and at least that's what my boss would say. And I would, even though I would check for extraneous Z's in my copy, I'd always have the Z's, and I'd be like, "Ah, man, I know better."
Yeah.
And yet but it's your brain just
And
totally makes it invisible.
yeah, and part of the reason why it's easy to do that is because many spell checkers for British English will accept both
Yeah,
because they're both fine.
yeah.
The Z spelling is so-called Oxford spelling, but people on the street, people in workplaces are much less comfortable with that Z now because they see it as a sign that a document has been Americanized.
I was also thinking the word theater is one of those
Mm,
words because not only is the spelling different, but theater also has a different meaning versus whether you're going to a movie theater or a theater. And it even here it does my head in because it's spelled both ways, you know?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think a similar thing, besides the spelling differences, we've got pronunciation differences. And sometimes, like a British pronunciation will come into America. Sometimes it's always been there, in some dialects. But I think about, I use both the words vase and vase, but a vase is more expensive than a vase. So you can do the same thing that you do with
Yeah.
spellings with pronunciations and have both, but they separate out a little bit.
Yeah, my daughter who's 12 now, when she was, a toddler, she watched Peppa Pig all day. And so occasionally she'll say a word in British English. Or like she says costume, not costume, and we're like, "What did you just say? That you didn't say it right." It's the little things. It's just so bizarre. So what's a British expression or usage that you've adopted in your own speech that you have to catch yourself code switching when you talk to Americans so you don't confuse them?
I mean, I think I don't catch myself all that often, and so they have to say, "What?" Um, I mean, so much of what I say now is British that I don't even, yeah, some of it's just so subtle I don't realize. I mean, I wouldn't say fortnight to an American, unless I was talking about the video game. Um, I mostly trust Americans to understand a lot of the British things because you pick it up from context. I suppose going back to words that have two meanings, I did catch myself recently saying nervy to an American and realizing after I'd said it that they might have misinterpreted it because in British English, nervy means nervous, whereas I think in American you'd interpret it more as somebody having a lot of nerve, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
somebody who barged in on you or something. So that's one where I didn't realize it till too late, but I probably misled somebody.
Are there any American expressions that you've noticed have started to creep into British English and
Oh,
sort of
lots,
recolonize the motherland there?
lots. There are so many, and but there are so many going the other way too these days. So we've got a lot more contact between the two countries and the two dialects than we did have, back before recorded speech, back before, Zoom, back before all sorts of things. So lots are going both ways. I'd say one that came up the other day in conversation was gotten. So I've gotten a new hat. That gotten was not used in most of Britain for quite a long time. And so you'd say, I've got a new hat. The gotten has really been coming back to Britain. It started here, right? Um, and you can still see it in other places like, misbegotten, forgotten, things like that. British people say all those things, but for some reason, people want to complain about gotten as a very ugly word that's made its way back, they'd say. But it's everywhere now. I mean, I listen to I've got a 17-year-old. All of her friends are saying gotten.
I remember being in middle school being told, don't say gotten, it's have got, have. I'm like, and it's not, it doesn't reflect how people actually speak. So, spoiler, you've become a British citizen and you're married to a Londoner. How has that personal integration affected your professional perspective on these language differences?
Well, it gives me a lot more exposure. And it also, it helps. It's hard as an American to understand what you're saying that's American. It's very easy to recognize what other people are saying that's not American, but it's hard for you to see your own language and what
Right.
other people aren't understanding. So if you're in a relationship where you're in that kind of contact all the time, you see it. And so, there are things I'll say, like if I ever say sure to answer a question, I, you know, get a lot of pushback on that because that's just, he sees that as just a completely negative thing to
Yeah.
say.
What
So,
do you mean? Sure, you're this. It's a
what do you mean,
confront.
sure?
Yeah.
He'll say, "Shall I make chicken for dinner?" I'll say, "Sure," and he'll say, "All right, I'll make uh, omelets instead." That wasn't what I said. So it's, I don't know that it's given me a different perspective, but it's given me a lot more
Certainly giving your husband a different one, right?
examples. Yeah, yeah. I mean, he lived off and on for 6 years in America, so he had, we could already talk to each other.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
I
I
mean,
think parenthood is the thing that really gives you a different perspective
oh
because
yeah.
here I am, I'm the child's mother. We talk about having a mother tongue. Well, already when my daughter was 2, she said, "Daddy says bath and you say bath." And I said, "What are you going to say?" And she said, "Bath." So it was already when she was 2 years old, she realized that I was wrong, everybody else was right.
So does she have a perfect little British accent now, and she's much older?
She's got she's got the accent that kids her age have in
And can she
lots of
switch? Can
English.
she switch?
She doesn't like to do an American accent, I think because she knows how harshly she'll be judged by her American family for it. But she had to get used to it at a young age. When we go over to the States of cousins following her around saying, "Say something English, say something English, say water," and things like
I love it. What's something about British English that you've come to appreciate more over the last 20 years that you initially found kind of annoying?
that. Well, I think because I was raised as sort of a grammar stickler, I have come to appreciate that not all of the rules that I had to be followed. It's I think because I have been dealing in both languages for so long, I think I've just come to the point where instead of being annoyed, I can just enjoy all the differences. So yeah. And there are lots of words. I love calling myself a numpty. There are lots of great things to to use in this language.
Yeah. In your research, have you found that technology and social media are making British and American English more similar, or are they still maintaining their distinctiveness across these social networks?
I mean, there's a lot of words going back and forth. Um, but I mean, the the linguistic landscape has just changed so much with social media and with people talking so much more to people who aren't physically there with them. So, I don't think my daughter is learning to speak American from all the American board game enthusiasts she talks to online, but surely they're getting a common vocabulary for talking about the things that they like to talk about. So, there are more words that are coming up that you cannot say, well, that started in Britain and that started in America, because they're coming up at the same time through an online presence. But so on the one hand, yeah, some things get more similar. On the other hand, as long as people want to feel themselves as being from a particular place or a member of a particular group, they're probably going to stick with speaking like that. And I think we're not seeing a great coming together of accents, for example. Its vocabulary goes here and there. Some grammatical things push here or push there, but the way we talk, not that different or not that similar in terms of what's changing. We're not changing in the same directions.
Well, what's amusing on social media, at least, is seeing Americans not understand British sarcasm or British humor and totally misreading what somebody is saying on social media.
Well, I think it's easy for anybody in social media to misread because it's hard to get the clues
Yeah.
that somebody's being sarcastic, which is why we've got emojis and all that kind of thing. But what's been fun on social media is to see things like a few years ago there was a thing about cheeky Nando's, right?
Yeah.
So somebody on Twitter said, "I'm just, I could go for a cheeky Nando's," and that became like the great American quest to find out what a cheeky Nando's was. And so, there's lots of room for us to have fun with each other's language.
That's what we say now. We have Nando's in Chicago, so that's what we say.
We
You want to go for a cheeky Nando's?
Well, Nando's started out in South Africa, so
Yeah.
I was thrilled to find them here too, because that was my great treat in South
So
Africa.
good.
Yeah.
So good. This is not a question to do with language or anything, but what are your favorite British food dishes that you've adopted since moving there?
Well, I mean, I'm supposed to be going low carb, so this is a very difficult
That's
question. I
hard.
mean, a crumpet is the best thing in the world. I love a crumpet, but I have not been eating crumpets lately. Yorkshire puddings,
Oh,
all those sort of great starchy things, are great.
do you
But
drink a lot
I
of
must
tea? Go ahead.
I don't drink tea, no. And I didn't used to drink coffee, but I became a coffee drinker over here because I realized that you cut off your social
Yeah.
contacts if you don't drink hot drinks.
Yeah, if you don't take a tea break or coffee break. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So, if you had to predict the future as a lofty academic, do you think we're heading more towards convergence or divergence between American and British English?
I think you've got both, and they will both continue to happen for as long as countries are a thing, you know.
In the year 3000, we'll still be debating the differences.
I mean, there'll be different differences,
Yeah.
but um, I mean, one of the things I quote in the book, I found a book from 1965, 66, somewhere around there, that was saying pretty soon all the British are going to be saying all of these American things. And they were exactly the same things that 45 years later I was reading in the paper. Pretty soon we're all going to say these American things, you know? So people are very bad at predicting what's going to happen with language. But what I'm confident in saying is it'll never all be one thing, because we are using it to express ourselves.
Right. All right. And for my final question, for Americans who are moving to the UK or for Brits who are moving to the US, what's your number one piece of advice for navigating linguistic and cultural differences?
Um, I think my number one piece of advice for anybody going to anywhere else is just to be humble, to listen and be curious and not be, ready to say what's right and what's wrong, so to try to enjoy what you're hearing. My number two piece of advice, if I can have two, is don't try to use the naughty words because you won't do it right. Um, so many people, so many Americans will come over and they'll want to, if you don't mind me saying some naughty words, they'll want to say bloody and wanker, and they will not use them in the right places. So just don't, let other
Just
people
don't.
do it. Enjoy it. You don't need to do it too.
So all those people browsing one of the most popular articles on our website about insults don't actually use them,
No,
only
enjoy
learn
them.
them, enjoy them.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and know when they're being applied to you.
Yeah,
That's the most important. Defensive insult learning is important. I mean, if you want to apply them to Americans in America, fine. That they'll take off in a different way and develop differently there. But yeah, when you try to use them to the people who know how to use them right, you can
Yeah.
fall for that.
Well, I'll be driving with my wife somewhere, and somebody will cut me off or do something idiotic, and I'll say I'll say a bad word, British word, and Jackie will go, "John, you're not in England. You don't live there. You can't use that word. Use the right one."
I think in the privacy of your own car, you can use whatever words you want to.
Whatever keeps the road rage away, right?
Yeah.
So, well, what a fascinating discussion this was, Lynne. Thank you so much for joining us on the Anglotopia podcast. We will link to Lynne's blog, Separated by a Common Language, and her book, The Prodigal Tongue, in the show notes. If you want to dive deeper into British American English language differences, that's the American edition. Apparently, I have the British edition, which is,
Yep.
I don't know how that happened. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, or comment. And if you like the Anglotopia podcast, please consider joining the Friends of Anglotopia Club, where you can get early access to new episodes and connect with other Britain enthusiasts. So join us next time as we continue exploring the people, places, and stories that make Britain's cultural heritage so endlessly fascinating to discover. So thank you so much, Lynne.
Thank you.